Okay, so contrary to what the program says I'm going to talk about, it says I'm going to talk about Alachua Audubon and conservation. My purpose today is to honor and recognize Bob Simons for 50 years of advocacy and leading all the conservation activities on behalf of Alachua Audubon. He's been the leading person on the board and probably within the county. His knowledge of ecosystems as a professional forester has been invaluable in providing expert guidance to Alachua Audubon as an organization and to the many agencies and businesses that he's worked with. Jim Buckner, a friend and colleague of Bob's, has this to say: Bob Simons is probably the most unsung hero I know for conservation of natural ecosystems in this part of Florida. And he's probably the most knowledgeable about ecosystem management here too. His long-term involvement with these issues means that he knows all the players. He knows everybody in all the various agencies, in the governmental and non-governmental organizations, and they all know and respect him. He's influenced the careers of many UF graduate students by leading field trips for Archie Carr and assisting them in identifying field sites for their research. He took various academic botanists such as Dr. Robert Godfrey and Dr. Daniel Ward to see rare and unusual plants, and so they could document their range, and as a consequence he's mentioned in many published flora of Florida. As a forestry consultant for the Nature Conservancy, he identified natural areas for potential purchase, and as already been mentioned, he nominated many of the big trees that are in the Florida Division of Forestry's champion tree database. Bob mentioned San Velasco, but he, as you said, very modest in terms of his contributions. You know, he and Helen Hood were the driving forces behind that, and Bob was responsible for doing all the mapping and inventorying, and he wrote the proposal that went to the state to encourage the acquisition of that property, and out of all the proposals that were submitted, that proposal was ranked #1, the top thing for purchase, and so it did get purchased. Jim Buckner shared one of his experiences with Bob. He said Bob was a longtime member of the board of directors of the Florida Defenders of the Environment, and Floridians had just elected a new senator, Paula Hawkins, and nobody had any idea what her stance was on conservation issues. So an invitation was sent to her to personally view the Ocklawaha and Silver Rivers by canoe to help her understand what the implications of the Cross Barge Canal would be on those properties. And so Jim called Marjorie Carr and asked her to send down the most knowledgeable people she had available to take a preliminary run on the river and strategize on the message. And she sent Jack Kaufman and Bob Simons, Jack for the history and details of the project, and Bob for the ecosystems under threat. Archie Carr, one of the best known and respected ecologists in Florida, later told me, whenever I have a question about Florida ecology, I call Bob Simons. And Senator Hawkins did oppose the completion of the canal. Bob was a key player in making the Silver Springs State Park a public land. Because of his previous experience with the Community and Rural Lands program, which was how San Velasco got purchased, he led his network of contacts amongst scientists and land managers throughout North and Central Florida, and his depth of knowledge and understanding of ecosystems were very important in getting Silver Springs purchased as a state park. And Jim adds, Bob Simons may well be the most knowledgeable person alive on native Florida trees. He should write a book. Bob also had a significant influence on the management practices of the U.S. Forest Service in Florida. His impressive knowledge and personal experience with management of forest lands were appreciated by the managers of several U.S. Forest Service districts, especially in Osceola and Ocala National Forests. Until the late 1980s, there were no Forest Service biologists with dedicated assignments to specific national forests in the peninsula, and they were not well versed in non-commercial species. The rare species inhabiting a particular forest were generally unknown to them, so not only were there no management plans for those species, they receive no management considerations at all. For example, the Ocala National Forest contains the largest area of contiguous sand pine scrub ecosystem in the world, but the Florida scrub jays, the only bird species exclusively endemic to that ecosystem and our state, receive no consideration at all. Neither did any other non-game species. Bob, being both a forester and an ecologist, helped educate and inform receptive national forest managers, and the management of those forests changed. Management considerations for stags and stumps and prescribed fire and site preparation and ecosystem maintenance all improved, as did the habitat quality. As Bob mentioned already, he was involved in the comprehensive inventory of natural areas and served for many years from its inception on the Land Conservation Board for Alachua County, helping identify natural areas for purchase for conservation. And he also served for many years on the City of Gainesville's Tree Advisory Board. So that all predates, I've been on the board for 10 years, and so since I've been on the board, I've watched Bob review numerous management plans for state parks and other public lands, and provide input, because they have to update their management plans every 10 years. He read voluminous documents on the Plum Creek plans for development in East Gainesville, and he led Alachua Audubon's opposition to that development, testifying at meetings, providing input. When DEP advanced a proposal 5 years ago to initiate grazing, timbering, and hunting on state parklands, Bob was the first to volunteer to represent Alachua Audubon on the Protect Paynes Prairie Coalition that included membership from the Sierra Club, the Gainesville Garden Club, ACT, and the Friends of Paynes Prairie. And 5 years on, he's still going to those meetings. So that we'll be poised to act if DEP threatens the state parks again. When Florida Power and Light asked for guidance on planting native plants and trees on their solar farms in Putnam County 3 years ago, Bob provided his expertise. And this earned us a grant from FP&L for a telescoping monitor and field camera for another one of Bob's projects, the Kestrel Walks program. And so the slideshow that was running earlier, you saw a number of pictures of some of our interns with the telescoping cameras that could look into the nest boxes. So over the last 15 years, he's spearheaded a long-term project to build, erect, and monitor American kestrel nest boxes in suitable habitat in the county, contributing to their nesting success. And then we started an internship program 2 years ago, and Bob's taken the interns under his wing and given them a really high-quality experience working with the Nest Box program. His most recent contribution has been working with the Department of Forestry to restore sparrow habitat at the Nunes Lake East property. Alachua Audubon paid for seed for the sparrow field, and Bob worked with forestry staff to develop a plan and identify appropriate native plants with which to seed the property. He and Rex Rowan have helped keep that project moving forward. On a personal note, Bob has put a strict conservation easement on a tree farm he owns in Suwannee County and has restored longleaf pine with a natural understory to provide wildlife habitat. So Jim Buckner has one final note to add. Another reason, and a significant one, that Bob has been so successful in influencing land managers on public and some private lands in Florida is his easygoing personality. People readily feel comfortable with them. He never comes across as being judgmental or condescending. I have mentioned that he is demonstrably knowledgeable and experienced, but he's also nice, friendly, intelligent, and kind. He's modest to a fault. Bob is generous, wise, and an outstanding mentor. He even has a great sense of humor. He's well-known, well-liked, and well-respected, particularly in forestry and conservation circles. But on top of all that, he is not perfect, which to the rest of us mortals, fortunate enough to know him well, probably makes him seem just about perfect. So Alachua Audubon is so very grateful to Bob for his more than 50 years of involvement with our organization and all the conservation projects in the county and in the region, and everything he's done to preserve and protect natural areas. Alachua Audubon enjoys a strong reputation in the community and is a respected conservation advocate, and that is in large part due to Bob Simon's contributions. Please come up, Bob.
surprise. Todd hopefully didn't know about this.
I did not know about it. My daughter said to me before, 2 hours ago out there, are you ready to be embarrassed? Well, yeah, I got embarrassed. You did a good job of doing that. I've enjoyed every minute of it. I mean, this is what I want to do. I love doing what I'm doing. And working with the interns is spectacularly fun and enjoyable. And all the other conservation work, well, a lot of it's been successful, so that makes it great. It's due to help from lots of other people, including a number of people that are in the audience here today.
Let's go to the sun.
I've got two little stories. Is this perfect?
Out of the light. A little farther.
Oh. Who's that old guy? I reckon. You can't really see it, but can you see that this is kind of white and messy right there on the door?
Yeah?
Well, that's a sign of success. This is a kestrel box. It's on Bob Wallace's property in northwestern Alachua County. And it's on a cabbage palm. And kestrels, when they nest, first of all, they don't put any nesting material in. We have to put the nesting material in. And then the baby birds just squirt poop everywhere. There's no cleanup crew. They don't scrub the walls. They don't sweep the floor. So when they're done nesting, that's just solid bird poop on the door and all around. So that means that box was successful. I got two really quick little stories. Both involve Marjorie Carr, who I think was probably the greatest environmental leader that Alachua County has ever produced. She invited me to go to two different conferences with her. One of them was both of them in the early 80s, shortly after Ronald Reagan had been elected president. One of them was with Forest Service staff from the National Forests in Florida. So Forest Service people from the Apalachicola National Forest, from the Tallahassee office, from the Osceola, and from the Ocala National Forest, all met for a several-day conference in a cabin. And they were doing a 10-year plan, a new 10-year plan for the National Forest of Florida. And they were seeking input, which was really great. So they asked about input on the Ocala National Forest. And I mentioned that they could do a little better job of providing, although they were doing a fair job actually, but accidentally, but they could do a little bit better job providing habitat for scrub jays, which you mentioned, or somebody mentioned. And they all said, "What's a scrub jay?" They didn't even know. So that's how now a lot of their management is dictated by what's good for scrub jays. But in 1982 or 3 or whatever, they didn't even know that there was such a bird. So they've come a long way since then. They also weren't doing any growing season burning at all. All of the prescribed burning was done in the winter. And I remember, and I wasn't the only advocate, there were a lot of advocates for them starting on the National Forest, starting to do growing season burning. On the Ocala National Forest, there was a great ranger who Jim Buckner knows his name. When I stand up here, my mind goes blank. My mouth doesn't quit.
Jerry Klutz.
Jerry Klutz, yes. So when he heard our little spiel about how great growing season burning would be for the habitat, he decided to give it a little try. So the first summer, after our meetings or whatever, he did about a dozen burns. He burned, I think it was 6,000 acres of summer burn. That was his little try, and he loved it. And everybody else loved it. And they've been doing it ever since on all the national forests. So that was a huge win, and it was in large part due to the bravery of Jerry Klutz. It's one thing to talk about it, it's another thing to go out and do it. The other little tidbit was another meeting that Marjorie brought me to. She and I had a lot of conversations, and I tried to interest her in global warming back in about 1980. And nobody was talking about global warming back then, hardly. But she listened. So Florida Power and Light, in about 1983, I'm not sure the exact date, held a conference down somewhere southeast of here, 50 or 100 miles, in a cabin that they owned. They had like 3 days we stayed in the cabin at night, and they provided meals. They brought the fella Hansen, who's still famous for his advocacy for doing something about global warming. They brought him down from Washington, D.C. They brought somebody from Denver. They brought the experts from around the country. Florida Power and Light, mind you, a power company burning coal to produce electricity. They brought these people and had a conference and listened to what the scientists said was happening with global warming in 1983. And there was no doubt at all in any of the scientists' mind exactly what was happening. We were burning fossil fuels. This was creating carbon dioxide. It was going into the atmosphere. It was increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that was acting as basically a blanket that was warming up the Earth. And it was happening. And it had been happening for 100 years. And it was getting worse every year. And it's still getting worse every year. And not just that it's getting warmer. We're still producing more, we're still burning more fossil fuels each year than we did but the year before. 2019, we burned more fossil fuels worldwide than we did in 2018. 2018, we burned more than, we're not addressing the problem. And they knew that back in 1983. So I figured I'd just make y'all happy by